Hello, my name is Victoria Helm, and I serve as Executive Director of Northwest Children's Fund. On behalf of our Board of Directors and staff, we're excited to have you join us this evening to discuss one of the most critical issues confronting us today. I'd like to thank Emily Kelly, who's right here. Thank you, Emily, and Foster Pepper for hosting us in this beautiful space and bringing us together. So thanks for arranging this great weather too. For those of you who don't know us, Northwest Children's Fund is a public foundation laser focused on the well-being of kids. Our core belief is that every child deserves to feel safe. Our work to support children, youth, and families is done in two ways. One, we make strategic grants to agencies working directly with high-risk populations. And two, we host educational forums like this one. We are here tonight because there are children and families in our midst who are in crisis. Our current immigration climate is impacting tens of thousands in Washington state alone. Probably everybody in this room knows someone who's living in fear of being deported or of losing a loved one to deportation. The topic of our current immigration situation is complicated, it's confusing, and seems to be continually shifting these days. It is, I think we would all agree, an enormous topic. In the time that we have tonight, we'll be hearing up-to-the-minute information about what's happening, how children and families are being impacted, about the role of adverse childhood experiences, what we call ACEs, and the long-term effects of toxic stress on children, and how we might best support our immigrant neighbors. We're so fortunate today to have two extraordinary individuals who are advocating on behalf of these children and families, and they'll be sharing their insights, their analysis, and expertise with us. Our first speaker is Jorge Baron. He's Executive Director of Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, often called NIRP. NIRP is a nationally recognized legal services organization dedicated to defending the rights of low-income immigrants. As many of you know, Jorge and NIRP have been in the news quite a bit lately as they fight unjust immigration policies and practices brought about under the current administration, including the travel ban and tougher immigration enforcement to increase the number of deportations, which is splitting up families. Our second speaker is Dr. Mike McNeil, who's a physician and pediatrics resident at Seattle Children's Hospital and the University of Washington. He's lived and worked in rural Argentina with the World Health Organization in Geneva, and will be working on a children's community health project next year in Kenya. He'll be talking to us about what he's observed and what he's learned in his work with a primarily Latino population in a South Seattle health center. While Jorge is going to be talking to us from a legal perspective and Mike from a medical one, I think you'll find that the issues that they identify are quite interrelated and help us understand what's at stake for our immigrant and refugee neighbors. Here's the format for the evening tonight. We'll first hear from Jorge, immediately followed by Dr. McNeil. And if we've got this timing right, there's still going to be about 20 minutes that we have for Q&A from all of us. We'll hold questions until both of our speakers have had a chance to present. The official part of this program is going to run until about 8:15. And at that time, our wonderful Northwest Children's Fund board members will be exiting the room to conduct a board meeting down the hall. And the rest of the audience is very welcome to stay to visit and chat with the speakers as they have agreed to stay on for a few minutes. We'll be making the slides available, and they'll be emailed to you after the event tonight. And our video, assuming that once it's done, it's going to be on our website. So I just want to check to see if there are any logistical questions. No? Well, with that, I think we'll get started. Ladies and gentlemen, Jorge Baron.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and thank you all for being here. I'm impressed both with the promptness of everybody. I came in at like 6:35 and like the room was already filled. Especially excited to have you all be here. I know with the nice weather we're competing with that, and so it makes me feel really good about that. I wanted to start off by just saying, really thank you for the interest, and I appreciate the opportunity that Victoria and the team at Northwest Immigrant Fund have given us to present and talk about this important topic, because I think one of the challenges with immigration policy is that a lot of times, precisely because it's something that's seen as contentious and creates a lot of passion, a lot of folks kind of feel uncomfortable engaging, and it's a big topic. And I think one of the things that we got to acknowledge is that I always tell people immigration is such an important topic. I mean, that's why it engenders the passion that it does, right? I mean, immigration policy is the fundamental question about what our country is going to look like down the road. And so, of course, it engenders a lot of passion, but that's also the reason that we should all be engaged in the conversation because it's such a fundamental question. I also want to acknowledge that Northwest Immigrant Rights Project has been generously supported by Northwest Children's Fund for many years, and we really appreciate that because our work could not be possible without the support of entities like Northwest Children's Fund. So for those of you that are donors and board members, I just want to give my thanks before we get started. For those of you that are not familiar with Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, I know a lot of you may be, but just a quick overview. We're a nonprofit organization that's been around for around 33 years. We started back in the mid-1980s when there was a need of Central American refugees coming to our region who were seeking protection, and a group of volunteer attorneys here locally and a number of folks from the community created this organization as initially just a volunteer-driven response, and we've since grown into a statewide nonprofit that operates from 4 offices, 2 in Eastern Washington, 1 office in Tacoma that I'll talk about a little bit more in detail in a minute, and then our office in Seattle. We serve approximately 10,000 people each year. Many of them, unfortunately, folks are in detention, and I'll get into that in a second. But most of our work is focused on providing direct legal services for individual folks navigating the immigration system in a variety of areas, and I'll cover some of them during my talk. But then we also do, and this is probably the stuff that gets actually the most in the newspaper, so people think that that's the bulk of what we do, but it's actually a more limited part of what we do, which is our systemic advocacy, which is mostly focused on the immigration in federal court, challenging immigration policies or practices both at the local level as well as the national level. And then our third part of our mission is community education, providing information to the community, both the broader community about immigration policy, but also about directly to immigrant community members about the realities of immigration. So, if I wanted to sort of give you an overview about immigration issues, I could talk for like 4 hours, but I'm really trying to narrow it down to a few things. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's changed. I'm not going to talk a lot about sort of the history, but just give you some idea of what's happening right now. What are the new developments? And I picked 4 numbers. Don't worry, these are all the numbers that I'm going to talk about. But I just thought these numbers would illustrate a little bit of what we're seeing. And some of these have been in the news recently. So 37% is the national increase in the number of arrests by Immigration and Customs Enforcement nationally since the president took office. So in the space of a little over 3 months, we've seen nationally an increase of 37%, which is pretty significant over that short period of time. And so that's just numbers that were released by ICE last week that were on the national media then. Locally here, the total number has been around similar to what the national level, around 33% increase. But more significantly, the number of people who have been detained who have over this, compared to the same period last year, who don't have a criminal record has gone up by 360%. And so that's actually the area where the Trump administration, the changes in policy has sort of been felt the most, has been that, President Obama, towards the end of his term, the last few years of his term, he had narrowed down the scope of immigration enforcement to focus kind of on 2 groups, people with more serious criminal convictions and then folks who are arriving at the border. But President Trump, in his 5th day of office, he issued this executive order that basically eliminated those priorities, and so you can start. This is kind of like the first sign of how that's impacting people on the ground level. That folks who otherwise, under the Obama administration, would probably not have been detained in the community, now certainly are. So that's locally. Now, that's having obviously a lot of impacts, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. But one of the real, problematic things that we're seeing is the level of fear that's generated in a lot of the community about coming forward for a number of things. So, and we can get into more detail in the Q&A about this. But for example, there's been, to us, we've gotten a lot of reports from our nonprofit partners, a significant decrease in the calls for assistance for a number of different social services. So we've heard from people, for example, who operate food banks, who told us that they're seeing a significant decrease on that. And it's hard to get, exact numbers, and there's like multiple factors sometimes operating in these situations. But one of the starkest figures that I've seen has been in Houston, Texas, where the local law enforcement reported that there had been this is a city with a very significant level of Latino community there, and they reported a 40% decrease in the reports of sexual assault by Latinas in Houston, in a very large city, over the same period. And there's just no other way to explain it than the fear that contacting law enforcement, especially in a place like Texas, obviously, where currently the legislation is about compelling, literally state legislation to compel local law enforcement to operate as immigration enforcement. So that's the kind of impact that we're seeing in nationally, and I think some of that impact is also things that we're seeing locally. And then that final figure of 39,324, so that is the number of people that the latest budget agreement set as the target for the number of immigration detention beds that we're going to be funding going forward. And that's a pretty significant increase. Before it was 34,000. But the recent budget agreement, there was a lot of attention paid to the fact that President Trump didn't get the funding for the wall. And while many of us see that as an important step forward, what was not as reported was the fact that there was this substantial increase in terms of immigration detention space. And the thing is that actually makes a big difference, because when ICE is trying to make decisions about whether to detain, they have a lot of authority to detain people. But one of the driving factors, as with a lot of things, is how much funding they have. And so the fact that they now have even more money to detain folks is going to have a real impact in the community going forward, especially as we see the increase in arrests and detention. So how does that play out locally? Well, here in our region, many of you know that we have this Northwest Detention Center, which is about 45-minute drive from here, which is the 4th largest immigration detention center in the country. And as we gathered here tonight, there's over 1,500 community members detained there, who are there not because of a criminal conviction or because of criminal arrest, but because they're facing immigration proceedings. So because the government is saying that they should be deported in their cases. And this is a picture a little bit of what the inside looks like at the detention center. And when they go through these proceedings, they're required to appear before an immigration judge in a courtroom that looks like this. And one of the big challenges that we have in our region and nationally is that people who appear before this immigration court, it looks very much like a court, like any other kind of courtroom, like you see here, right? It's kind of what people think of as a courtroom. They have an immigration judge with a black robe. You have a government attorney on one side who's the prosecutor, who's making the case for why people should be deported. What's different about this type of courtroom is that if you're on the other side, on what in a criminal case would be considered like the defense table, but in this case it's the person who's facing deportation, you don't necessarily get an attorney in that situation. So even though the decision that's going to be made is one of the most significant decisions that is going to be made in somebody's life, you don't have the right to appointed counsel in immigration court proceedings. So if you have the money to hire a private attorney, then you can bring your attorney. But if you don't have money, you don't get one. And the statistics in Tacoma, particularly the people who are detained, are particularly dire because over the last few years, the representation rate for cases that are completed in Tacoma is that only about 8% of the people end up being represented by an attorney in their immigration court hearings. And the rate of success for a person in completing their deportation cases while in detention go up by a factor of 10 if they have an attorney or not. Not 10%, but like they're 10 times more likely to succeed in their cases So if we're thinking about something like asylum, for example, and you're trying to put that case on by yourself, your chances of succeeding are just extremely, extremely limited. So they are given a piece of paper to the immigration judges will pass on this piece of paper, the list of free legal service providers in the Tacoma Detention Center. And I appreciate that they make it a plural because I think that makes them feel better, like there's multiple, but unfortunately for Tacoma, there's only, there's three, there are 3 listings, but there are 3 of our offices, so it doesn't really help us because we're going to end up calling the same number ultimately. So that's what they get, but the reality is that the folks, and I think one of the things that I want to emphasize is that the folks who are going through this situation, are people who are our neighbors and people who are going through sometimes with deep ties to the community. So I wanted to shift a little bit. This is kind of in the broader picture. I want to talk a little bit about impact on youth and families and how we see this related to some of the work that Northwest Children's Fund helps support. And I could talk about the law a lot, but I don't want to do that because I always want to think it's more important to talk about the people. And so I just want to share 3 stories that kind of illustrate a little bit of what we're seeing locally of how this is playing out. Some of them are more recent cases, and some just illustrate some of the things that we're seeing happening now. So the first case that I'll talk about is Emmanuel. So Emmanuel is a young man who came to the United States when he was 6 years old from Mexico. And he has been living here in the U.S. since he was 6 years old. He's gone to school, graduated high school, and he is one of the recipients or the beneficiaries of a program that President Obama launched in 2012 that some of you may have heard about. It's called the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And for those of you who are not familiar with that program, this is something that President Obama launched because people, despite the fact that people have lived here since a very young age, there is no law in our immigration laws that says that just the fact that you've lived here for a very long time means that you're going to be able to stay in the United States. And to illustrate that, let me tell you about a case. I started my career at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project at the Tacoma Detention Center, working, well, not at the Tacoma Detention Center, but working the office that serves the Tacoma Detention Center. And back in 2007, when I was an attorney there, I did an intake with this young woman who had been arrested in Spokane. She was 19. And she had been arrested because they had recently graduated from high school. She and a friend of hers had broken into her old high school and started drinking. And so they got arrested for trespassing, right? Because they were, screwing around like I'm sure many of us did, or at least some of us did. So anyway, if you're a U.S. citizen and that happens to you, she would have, gotten, something minor and walked away. But because she was here undocumented, that was not what happened. She was actually sent to the detention center and being held there. And I did this intake with her, and she was very upset that she'd already been detained for a couple of weeks. She thought that this was a complete outrage, which it was. But I don't think she quite understood the magnitude of what was happening, because when I talked to her and I reviewed her situation and I asked her if she had any U.S. citizen, children or parents or anything like that, the answer was no. I explored other things. I asked her if she was afraid of going back to her home country, and she said, well, mostly because I've never lived there. And so I asked her, well, how old were you when you came to the U.S.? And she said, I don't remember, but my mom tells me I was 8 months old. She carried me as a baby across the border. And so I explored all these other options for her, and at the time, I had to tell her that, despite the fact that she lived here basically her entire life, that all she could ask the immigration judge was voluntary departure, that there wasn't anything in the laws that prevented her from being deported. And I remember very clearly, she was like, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to talk to the judge. And I said, please do. And I wish I could tell you something different. I honestly think this is terrible outrage, but as a lawyer, I have to tell you what the laws are. And right now, in your situation, there isn't any option to be able to fight off deportation. And she was ordered deported. She got a voluntary departure, but it still meant that she had to leave the country. And so that was the situation that happened before 2012, that there wasn't anything in the law that prevented people like her from being deported. So President Obama launched this program to prevent people in that situation from being deported. And of course, that was one of the things that during the campaign, President Trump said that he would undo when he came to office. Now, the good news is that he hasn't actually followed through on that part of his promises regarding immigration, so he hasn't undone the DACA program. However, there has been a significant shift that they've started picking up people for relatively minor things that they find in their record. So McNeil was one of these guys, individuals who've had the DACA status. He was, he's been, working and doing well until earlier in this spring. He was in a pretty significant car accident. Unfortunately, resulted in both of his legs being broken, and he had to be on a wheelchair. And he started getting kind of teased by people the fact that he was in a wheelchair, and so he, tired of that, he got a knife because he felt kind of vulnerable, and he just showed it when these guys started like harassing him, and he just showed the knife to try to protect himself. And because of that, they arrested him, and the local police arrested him and charged him with like a weapons offense. He hadn't hurt anybody, he just tried to like protect himself. But because of that arrest, all of a sudden immigration became involved in his case, and even though he was still in a wheelchair, brought him to the detention center in Tacoma and put him in, and said that his DACA status is being terminated, and that he is now subject to deportation, despite the fact that he's lived here in the United States since he was 6 years old, and there had never been any other problems despite this physical condition. Now, the good news with McNeil's case is that we were able to work with a pro bono attorney to get him a representation, so he's actually been released from detention, and he's back with his family in Oregon. So that's the good news. The bad news is that he's still facing deportation proceedings, right? So the decision about whether he gets to stay or not has not yet been finalized. So his case is still pending, and so this is one example of like, young people who've been here literally their entire lives, even though the DACA program hasn't been terminated, it's become a lot less protective than it did before, because any minor action that likely probably would have resulted in being detained under the Obama administration has certainly shifted now. The next case I wanted to talk to you about, another issue that I think has been happening more over time, and you probably heard a lot about, has been the continued issue of unaccompanied minors coming to the U.S. and seeking protection for place. Primarily, we've seen the highest numbers from Central America, and that has been an issue that has been, there's always been numbers of people coming from unaccompanied minors coming to the U.S., but the numbers have really significantly increased, really multiplied over the last 4 or 5 years. And so that is an issue that continues to be a high priority, and one that a lot of organizations are working on. I want to particularly recognize my colleagues who are here, from Janet and Julie from Kids in Need of Defense, who are in the back. You can wait. Who are our partners and who do tremendous work in this area of defending unaccompanied children and connecting them to pro bono attorneys. Jose is one of those cases that we were able to work with to get representation, because even children are not entitled to an immigration attorney in immigration court proceedings. So Jose was one of these unaccompanied children who came to the U.S. At a young age and had been facing deportation proceedings. He lived in Eastern Washington and was there and facing deportation hearings when our Granger office was able to take on his case. And the situation for this group is particularly challenging in that the age of 18 has become a very for a lot of people, I was recently at a birthday party for somebody who had turned 18, and it was this joyous occasion, right, adulthood. But in the case of unaccompanied children, turning 18 can put you in a whole different category that can actually make your life much more difficult. And Jose was in that situation where he was approaching this age where he was going to be aging out of the protections that he might possibly be entitled to under immigration law. So that has put a lot of strain on services, because we've had to make sure that we try not to miss any children that are going through that process. And then one of the good news that I want to share with you is that we have been able to work with the state legislature this year to change some of our state laws to help have more people be qualified for protection after the age of 18. So there was a little bit of a technical issue that because of the way our state law was structured, people weren't eligible to apply for protection until up to age 21, which is what federal law allows, but we've just been successful in getting this change made in state law that are going to enable people to apply even after the age of 18. So this is another issue where we're having children who are perhaps don't have the ties that they've had to the region the way the Dreamers do, but they're now in this vulnerable situation. And for them, they're actually usually already in deportation proceedings, so they're facing this momentous decision that's going to be made in the short term. And then the other situation that I wanted to illustrate is the issue of parents with children who are, so perhaps the children are U.S. citizen children. Some of them may be undocumented themselves, but in a lot of the cases that we see are situations where people have come and had children here in the U.S. and now they're facing the prospect of being deported. And we're seeing a tremendous number of cases of that happening with this increase in arrests. So, a couple of weeks ago we had our fundraising event, and it was kind of a very hectic day. But as soon as I got to the office, we were getting calls about a situation in South Seattle where two parents had gone off to drop off their kids at one of the local schools down in that area, and as they walked back, immigration agents detained the father who was there on an immigration violation. And what's happening with those cases is that usually they are looking for somebody for a particular issue, and so they are kind of targeting enforcement on a particular individual. Sometimes that, I think ISO says, well, we're not really rounding up everybody, we're just people with specific situations. But it always brings me back to, so I don't have specific stories to tell you that I can share right now about cases like that, but it brings me back to one of the early cases that I worked on, and that was the case of Liliana, because this is kind of the stereotypical case that is now getting picked up, because this is a person who they say, well, she had a prior deportation order, and that's why she's the target of enforcement. And so Liliana's case is that she actually came to the U.S. when she was about 16. She was one of those unaccompanied minors just a long time ago. And she fled the situation. She's originally from Guatemala, and she fled because she was going through some very serious abuse within her family. So the only way that she thought she could escape was to come to the U.S. And so she did, and eventually settled here in the Seattle area because she was facing, because this is where she had some relatives here who could protect her. So she started working in the restaurant industry, and actually, unfortunately, was working in a restaurant that was eventually raided by immigration during the Bush administration, and so she was placed in deportation proceedings, and her case was pending. She got an attorney, because at the time she had been working and she could afford to hire an attorney. Unfortunately, that attorney ended up being somebody that eventually was disbarred, but she did have a private attorney initially in her case. So the case was pending. She wasn't detained because at the time we weren't detaining people. She had no criminal records, so she wasn't put in detention initially. She was released, and her case had been pending. Well, while the case was pending, she was unfortunately subject to a very serious episode of domestic violence that ended up resulting in her being in a domestic violence shelter. By this point, she actually had a young daughter who was a U.S. citizen who was born here. And so she and her daughter ended up in this domestic violence shelter. And she she was just out of the shelter and finally kind of getting her life back together, but kind of in a bad situation. And she had dropped off her daughter to school this fall morning. She had just gotten a job, so she dropped off her daughter at school, and she was on her way to work. And she was at a stop at a light, and somebody rear-ended her. Small traffic accident, which normally is not, a big deal. I mean, it's definitely an inconvenience, but what happened next is that the police department came and as they took the report, they ran her driver's license and they told her, well, it shows here that you have a deportation order. And so she didn't know that she had a deportation order. It turns out that her appeal had been denied while she had been in the domestic violence shelter, and she had no idea this had happened. So the police took her and transferred her to the Northwest Detention Center, where she showed up and was detained. And ICE officials told her, well, you're going to be deported. She said, well, can I go before a judge? And I said, no, you don't get to go before the judge because you already have a deportation order. So I met with her. At first, she didn't want to fight her case because she didn't want to stay detained. I told her that she might have an avenue to reopen her case, but she didn't want to fight it initially. And then she called me back later and said, I changed my mind and decided to do it. And when I asked her why she wanted to fight her case after she initially didn't want to, she said, because of my daughter. Because I realized that if I did fight my case, I would have to make a choice of either leaving her here by herself with a relative that I'm here, probably never see her again, or take her back with me to a place where I escaped because of the violence, and I just could not make that choice. And so I decided to fight the case to be able to stay here. I'm thankful to say that Liliana, we're fortunate to be able to get her case reopened and keep her here. And so she's like the good story, right? She was able to stay reunified even though she spent 3 months of detention away from her daughter. But that's like the good news. And I can tell you that there's a lot of Lilianas, unfortunately, who either don't get help and don't get their case reopened, or who don't have a way to reopen her case and end up getting deported, and they have to face that choice that Liliana, thankfully, did not actually have to choose. So those are just some quick illustrations. I'm out of time. I try to go through, but I didn't even make it. So I look forward to your questions, and I really want to talk more about this conversation. Here's a picture of the good story of her being reunified. And then for those of you that are social service providers, I just want to make sure that you know about our website. There's some resources there, and I can talk more about it in detail after Dr. McNeil. All right, thank you so much.
Well, first off, I just want to thank you guys for the opportunity to chat today. I also want to thank Jorge for all the work that he seemed to do at the Immigration Rights Project. I'm also grateful for you guys, the Northwest Children's Fund, and all that you guys do to help address children to stay out in the community who have to deal with abuse and neglect. I'm actually just frankly humbled for the chance to be able to talk to you guys tonight. I work at an institution in a university where there's an incredible amount of research going on by people in a wide walk and a variety of departments who are looking at the problem of adverse childhood experiences and in particular how we can better intervene and prevent these things from happening. I also get the chance to work with pediatricians at a variety of different clinics, both at the University of Washington, the satellite clinics at Odessa Brown, at Harborview, and at Seattle Children's itself. And I have the chance about once a week to work at CMAR and be able to work with patients there. And it's really an awesome opportunity to be able to talk about what we see in this community, and I hope I make them proud this evening. I also want to point out that I am not a recent immigrant to this country. I don't know if you my grandparents immigrated from the foreign land of Alberta, Canada in the 1950s, and that's about as exciting as my family history gets. However, I've had the privilege over the last 10 years to be able to work with a wide variety of patients and people from Central and South America, and I truly fallen in love with the culture. I've felt embraced by them. I felt embraced, and for that reason, I've been particularly passionate about this subject, and I'm grateful for the chance to talk to you guys about it today. I want to start off with a quote. It's a quote that I heard a couple of weeks ago that I really liked, and I hope that it's the theme of our discussion this evening, and hopefully for the rest of our careers. It's by a man named Neil Maxwell, and he said, "You must tread carefully on the hollow ground of another's suffering." And I just want to have us keep that in mind as we have these discussions today, because this is not light subject material, right? We're talking about children and families who have gone through some shocking experiences, some very challenging experiences. And I'll be using numbers and data. I'm sorry, I have more numbers than Jorge. I apologize for that. There'll be a few more than 4. But I hope that we never forget that behind each number that there's a child, that there's a family, that these are real people and real events that have happened, and that we must tread cautiously on that. We must respect that and recognize that it is hollow ground in its own right. So briefly, my objectives today will be first to go quickly over adverse childhood experiences. I hope you had the chance to look over and watch the TED Talk by Dr. Burke Harris. She does a phenomenal job of talking about adverse childhood experiences, much better than I could. And so I hope that it invites you guys to listen to that. I'll use kind of some of the data just to talk a little bit more specifically about this population that I work with. I'll also have the chance to look a little bit more in who is impacted and what we see in the immigrant community. And then finally, what do we do about it, right? And be able to discuss what we're doing. So, as mentioned by Dr. Burst Harris in the TED Talk, in 1998 there was a study that came out called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it really is a landmark study to help bring this understanding of what experiences and trauma that occurs in childhood, how that will impact a human for the rest of their life. And so it was done by a group in Kaiser with San Diego in conjunction with the CDC, and they had over 17,000 adults fill out an experience and survey about the experiences that they had in childhood. And they defined ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, into 3 general categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Now, when we talk about deportation, which we've talked about a lot already and we'll continue to talk about, that falls under the category of household dysfunction, and in particular with an incarcerated relative. But all of these things we do see in the community that I have the chance to work with. What was shocking was how prevalent these things were, right? That on the left you see the prevalence of all of the different types of adverse childhood experiences. In the top right corner you see that over 60% of people who filled out the survey had had at least one adverse childhood experience in their youth, and many more than one. And that what was most important with the study was to show that as someone accumulated more adverse and traumatic events in their youth, the more likely they were to have poor health outcomes. Now, what are those health outcomes? There's a lot, right? And I think what's important to see, this is a lot of text, but it's not exhaustive. It's extensive, but not exhaustive. There's more that we are learning every year about the consequences of adverse childhood experiences. And certainly that, when you have adverse childhood experiences and the trauma of that, you have increased risk of risk behaviors, tobacco use, alcohol and drug abuse. But even in the absence of that, for those that they saw that just had traumatic events and adverse childhood experiences, they had worse health outcomes overall: increased heart disease, increased chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, liver dysfunction, even death. But I think what's really important about this study is who did they study, right? So this is some of the demographics of the study. And I want you to see 75% of the participants in the study were white, right? Only 11% were Hispanic, and 5% were African American, and 2% other, right? And that over close to 40% had a college degree. Right? And even here, they say that they wanted to reflect a middle-income demographic. So one, I think this is discouraging to see how prevalent this is across demographics, that this is not just something of a lower socioeconomic status and something that we can just ignore and say, oh, it's in a certain group. But two, a lot of the discussion that we're having today is about people who are having these issues of living in poverty, living in household dysfunction. And I think that while the study is fantastic, I think that there's a lot more that we can learn about the population that we'll be talking about today. So I think I want to take the rest of this time to kind of talk a little bit more about the Hispanic community, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other communities that I work with. But I want to focus on the Hispanic community because one, this is the community that I work with the most. So I have a little bit more experience with that. Two, I think the policies in place that we've been hearing about recently really bear a significant burden on this population. And third, I believe that this community provides a great example of what the immigrant and refugee community are facing as a whole. So the Hispanic community is the fastest growing immigrant community in the United States, and it's actually predicted by the year 2050 to become the majority. That those that have their country of origin will be from mostly of Hispanic origin. And so this is a fast-growing and important discussion because this is going to be an important demographic makeup of our country. Over 53% of children in the United States who are Hispanic have at least one parent who is foreign-born, and close to 40% where both parents are foreign-born. Many of those are undocumented. In fact, over 4 million U.S. children in the United States who were born in the United States and are U.S. citizens have parents who are undocumented. It's a significant number. 1 in 3 live in poverty. And that number goes up if their parents go on board. And I think a lot of that has to deal with the fact that those that are undocumented are unable to get access to some of the government services that are provided to those that are citizens. And that's hard, especially when you have a child who is an American citizen, who has the right to government assistance, whether that be food stamps, Medicaid, things along those lines, and are unable to get it because of the status of their parent. And so a lot of times we hear about parents who will fake social security cards and kind of information like that in order to get access for their family. But a social security card that is falsified is an offense and is a crime that can then lead to deportation if it's found out. And you know, it's been very tough to overcome the logistical hurdles. Luckily, we live in a state where children, regardless of their immigrant status, their citizenship, get health care. And so we're lucky enough that greater than 95% of children in the state of Washington have health care. Sadly, there are still a substantial number that don't have health care for some reason or other. A lot of that, and especially over the last couple of months, is parents being afraid to seek out those services with concern and an increased risk of deportation. Now, what does the literature show about adverse childhood experiences in the Latino community more specifically? The National Child Traumatic Stress Network shows that Latino youth have on average of 3.2 traumatic experiences in their youth. And in particular, they had a higher exposure to violence seen at home, in their neighborhoods, and their schools. And this is consistent with other immigrant and refugee communities who, because of the experiences that they have and living in poverty, that they are living in poorer neighborhoods where there are higher risks for violence and crime. Also, we see that they have lower uses and rates of primary care, child welfare, and outpatient psychiatric services. Again, there is that, even though that they have the right to these things and that our state allows children to have this, there's still lower rates of utilization because of that overarching fear and concern. Other research has shown that Latino youth endorse greater total number of victimization experiences than non-Latino white youth. That they have greater rates of sexual assault, sexual harassment, and family abduction. They have increased risk of anxiety and depression, especially among those first-generation Latino youth who come into the country. And that they also report higher levels of post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, I had the privilege last month to actually go out to Yakima and Toppenish to talk with some of the mental and behavioral health consultants out there. And ask them about kind of what's been going on with the political climate. In that community, the majority of people are Hispanic. Over 45% of the communities in Yakima County are actually Hispanic. And they were actually pretty concerned and disconcerted about the discussion. There was actually a teacher at a local school who was suspended for having anti-immigrant and very racist comments on her Facebook page about some of the students who were Hispanic in her community. And how does that feel as a student going to this class, or as a parent sending your child to a teacher who has these feelings about your race or ethnicity? And in fact, one behavioral health consultant talked with me about the fact that they are just overwhelmed with youth and children coming into their clinics concerned and having higher rates of anxiety and depression. And in fact, there was one youth that the behavioral health consultant was talking to me about who refuses to leave her home, no longer goes to school. Her anxiety and fear is so great that she cannot leave the house because her fear is that she will leave and go to school one day and her parents won't be there when she gets home. And so this can really be quite debilitating. The other thing that we see in clinic, and I'd like to break this up into two different categories as far as what I've seen in clinic and what some of my colleagues are seeing. And I think these two books provide great examples of what we see. And the first is what happens to these children and these families before they even arrive in the United States and what happens after they get here. So Enrique's Journey is a book written by Sonia Nazario. She's a reporter at the LA Times. And she recounts the experience of Enrique. He was a teenage boy from Honduras whose mother had already come to the United States to work, and he came to follow her. So he is a classic example of an unaccompanied minor. And what
he experienced, she describes in detail from his first-hand accounts. But what's pretty remarkable is Sonia actually goes down to Honduras and follows his trail by riding the trains like he did and interviewing people along the way. And it's a pretty remarkable story, and something that when I first read, I thought, okay, this is a little extreme, there's no way. And then I've met families and patients in the clinic, and talked with other colleagues who've talked with families who've gone through this. She describes in detail the risk of riding these trains and trying to jump on the trains as they're moving, and that there's a frequent amount of people who end up dying because of falling off, or the trauma, or getting maimed, and the horrible injuries and catastrophes that can happen with that. She also describes the gangs and drug cartels, and even the police officers that line this rail system that take advantage of these people who are trying to make it to the United States. It's quite a harrowing tale, and sadly more common than not. In fact, we've already talked about this a little bit. The numbers are showing that close to 50 to 60,000 children a year are coming to the United States unaccompanied, and that it has really increased over the last couple of years, and that many of them have been robbed, beaten, or raped multiple times before they even get here. And so it's what would bring a parent to do this, right? Why would they send their child through such risky things? And a lot of it is because of the current climate of their country of origin, right? Also talking with families, from Syria and Iraq. I had a chance to go to the international rescue community to kind of talk with them about some of the experiences that they had in Syria and Iraq before they came over, and the horrible human rights violations that these children have to go through, and watching family members and friends be tortured and killed, and that these children are already coming to the United States with horrible trauma and the stress and the impact that has. And again, in talking with these families and they would much rather stay in their home country. It is not something that they do this for fun, right? They do it to seek refuge, to seek asylum, to seek peace. And that these families feel that it is better for their children, and especially with these unaccompanied minors, to leave their home country to get to the United States and go through this risk because of they would be better off than what they're going through at home. The other thing that we see is that after they've gone through these experiences and they've gotten to the United States, there's still risks, right? The second book is Immigrants Raising Citizens by Hirokazu Yashikawa. And he talks about what it's like to be a child being raised by undocumented immigrants, and the constant fear and stress and strain of being caught and deported prevents these families from getting the services that they need, as I talked about earlier. And that he's been able to show through data that these children fall far behind their colleagues and children of the same age in school and in health outcomes. And they contributed that back to the fact that they don't get the services that they need because their parents are too afraid to go and seek these services. And that has really, I feel personally, gotten worse over the last little bit, and as families are afraid to go to people of authority because of that risk of being caught. Luckily, at Seymour, I haven't really felt a significant impact on my patient panel. They're still able to come and still feel confident, but there are rumors that spread about ICE officials waiting outside of clinics and ICE officials waiting outside the government offices, and so people avoid it, and that just leads to adverse outcomes in their children. And then finally, as we've alluded to, we are seeing an uptick in parents who are being deported. At the number that Jorge already brought up, close to 40%, 37% of increase since January in deportations, and that a lot of those are people who have not been offended, are not offenders from anything else, and that is about a 33% increase in the area. So what do we do about it, right? I think the first thing that we do is identify vulnerable patients. There's been an incredible work in something called a medical legal partnership. And it is where doctors and lawyers work together. You heard that right, yes, doctors and lawyers working together. a great example of this today, of trying to help patients. A great example is asthma. If we realize that, a patient comes in and they're constantly having asthma exacerbations, and we keep giving them albuterol inhalers to take care of them, it doesn't solve the problem if every time they go home, their house is filled with mold or roaches or mice droppings or things like that. And so we provide opportunities with working with lawyers and providing forms and documentation to landlords or other people to get these children the environment that they need to reduce the risk of an asthma exacerbation. And evidence has shown that this worked. And so we're hopefully going to continue this trend with the current political climate we have with immigration. And in fact, there's a nice little mnemonic, because we always have mnemonics in medicine to help us remember things, called I help, to kind of help us better understand some of the questions that we need to ask as physicians to better understand the legal impacts on their health. And I help stands for, I don't know if you can see it, but income and insurance, housing, education, employment, legal status being a very important component to that and what we're talking about today, and then personal and family stability. The other thing that we need to do is educate. Educate providers, better understanding what these policies do to their patients. It was actually really exciting because just this past week in the Seattle Children's Intranet, there was a big page about how we help our families and patients deal with these current immigration policies. It was quite timely, and what this provides is for the physicians and other providers of Seattle Children's to better understand what are the different things and resources they can provide for the patients to help them in these situations, and to help the providers themselves understand what they can do and how we can create safe places for our patients. It's sad when we have a family say, hey, if I forget to give my child their medication, are you guys going to report me so I get deported? That's horrible. It's something that's wrong, and we need to be better as far as providers in helping them understand that it's a safe place, that they should get the care that they deserve. And the other thing is providing education to families. We're to help them with understanding what should be their contingency plans, who should be there, if something were to happen, who will take over the care of their child, and make sure that there's a chance for us to continue to be involved so that their child doesn't get lost, especially if there's medical needs. And the last thing is to advocate. I've been very proud of the being a pediatrician and seeing what the American Academy of Pediatrics has done to advocate for families. In fact, in 2017 at the annual leadership forum, when the leadership for the American Academy of Pediatrics came up with their top 10 resolutions for this year, the top 3 were about protecting immigrants and refugees, including building access to legal representation, thank you, Jorge, for children, adolescents, and families seeking safe haven, protecting children of migrants, and a response to executive order limiting immigration and entry. There was a recent policy statement by the AAP about not separating mothers and children at the border, and advocating for that, and ensuring that we have these safe zones and continuing to work. And there's a growing community within the AAP and the rest of the pediatricians that I've had to interact with in trying to protect our patients. So in conclusion, I think we can all agree that ACEs are a pervasive problem in our country, right? And it crosses all walks of life. It's also important to see that these stressors occur in higher levels, and a lot of this stems from our current policies that we have in place. And I think I would, it's easy for me to say, and I can say wholeheartedly, it is much better for a child to have their parents. I think that's something that can be obvious, but something that still needs to be stated, that for my patients, it is much better if they have an active and engaged parent, and that they'll be better off. And we need to find and integrate policies that provide security, but also compassion. And I'm grateful for you and all that you guys do, and I hope that we can better understand how we can take care of these children who've gone through unspeakable tragedies and make sure that they provide a place that's safe and where they feel like they have a home. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. McNeil. And now I'm going to moderate the Q&A, so I'm going to open the floor. We want to hear from you. Thoughts, questions? Excellent. Congratulations for being the first one. Sometimes it's always like, go.
My question is sort of a clarification question about what the ICE rules are currently and if they have changed in this regard. I work with a lot of immigrant and refugee families in South Seattle, and something that I've always thought to be true is that schools are safe havens, so to speak. ICE officials are not supposed to go there, they're supposed to have a safe distance. And you mentioned an anecdote about some parents who were picking up their child and ICE agents came and arrested them. Could you clarify what that rule is and how it works, and if it's still in effect or going to be changed?
Sure, thanks for that. So the answer is yes, it's still in effect. So there's something called Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, has a memo. So it's an internal policy, it's not a law, but the policy says that there are that the sensitive locations are schools, including childcare places, medical facilities, and churches or congregations or faith communities. That those locations are ones that it doesn't say that immigration agents are prohibited from going into, but that are particularly sensitive, and so immigration has to have supervisory approval, and they're generally discouraging enforcement in or directly around those facilities. I haven't seen recently instances of that actually happening inside one of those facilities, okay? So there is that assurance, but that doesn't prevent them from, for example, in the situation in South Seattle that I mentioned, the parents were walking towards school, so they were on the street. They were a few blocks away from the school, and unfortunately, of course, the way that people in the community got the word around was that they were dropping their kids out of school, shorthand. So people may have perceived that it was there because I talked to some teachers, and they told me that there were very high levels of absenteeism the days after that, because people got the word that the parents had been detained on their way to school. And that was actually factually accurate. I mean, it was actually after they drop off the kids at the school. So the policy is there, but it's, so it should give some protection, I think, for folks who work in those locations, that ICE is not generally going to come in there. I can't tell people, and we can't tell people that it will never happen. We still think those institutions should have their own policies about what to do, because they themselves can take protective steps by refusing entry to those facilities unless they have a warrant, or basically unless they have a warrant. So if it's not a public area of the building, any owner of that facility can prevent ICE from coming into a non-public area of the building.
Is there something that parents can do kind of preemptively to ensure that there's maybe another guardian that can take over care of their children if they were to get deported?
Do you want to talk about something?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the things that in the AAP toolkit, the American Academy of Pediatrics toolkit, something that actually in that webpage that I talked about that came out with Seattle Children, there's forms that parents can fill out to say, if something were to happen to me, this will be the guardian of my child. And it's actually encouraged that families do that, especially if there are medical needs or anything else that is going on, to make sure that there are contingency plans. It is something that, we wish that it wouldn't be the case, but it is something that we are having that conversation more and more with patients in the hospital and the clinic, and making sure that if something were to happen, that they do have someone else there to help with the decision-making process.
So do they have to be somebody who's seeking medical care to fill that out, or can anybody access those forms?
Anybody can access those forms.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there's actually been some local work. Partners at Legal Counsel for Youth and Children have developed a toolkit that's actually up on our website under the resources tab. And that is something that anybody, and we encourage anybody, it doesn't have to be the people that are seeking, that have ongoing medical care, but certainly I think particularly important for the reasons that Dr. McNeil stated, to make sure that there's continuity in care. So those are documents that we are encouraging, people to, fill out. It's not a formal guardianship. Meaning in terms, it's not like a court-appointed type thing. It's just the way that any of us or parents sort of, designate, leave our children with a babysitter or with a relative, right? But this is like more formal documentation so that they can be shown, for example, to a medical provider that you're authorizing this person to do follow-up care and things like that. There's some situations where people may need more formal legal documents, but these are kind of informal things that are important for people to be prepared. You know, we want to be careful. We don't want to stress out people that, you know, that they're definitely going to get separated, but we think it's, I try to, when we do community education events, I kind of tell people, you know, it's kind of like an earthquake, right? We hope it doesn't happen, but we have to be prepared for it.
So right now, do children end up in foster care, or do they end up with that designated person?
The reality that I see in the experiences that I've had is it's a mix. So there are situations where children end up in the child welfare system who are, you know, for example, parent. I mean, you know, the murder story of Ileana, where she dropped off her kids to school and was her daughter at school. So she was lucky in that she was able to make a call and get a relative to come pick up the child at the end of the day, and she had her authorized as an emergency pickup. Now, if she hadn't been able to make that call, at the end of the day, the school would have called CPS to place them with them because nobody showed up, and that does happen. And so in other cases, you know, they end up with relatives or somebody else in the family knows, and that's usually the, you know, best, I don't want to say the ideal, because the ideal is they be with their parents, but that's the least bad outcome in that situation. There's a question in the back. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering how nonprofits that provide legal services to immigrants, I mean, there are so many cases, how do you prioritize which cases to take? Like, is it according to need, likelihood of success, or?
It is a heartbreaking decision that we hate to have to make. So it depends a little bit on some of our programs. For example, our domestic violence program, where people are not necessarily in deportation proceedings, we just have a wait list. And it's a little bit first come, first served with some priorities for people who are deportation proceedings. But right now we have over 800 people on the wait list for the Seattle office for domestic violence, just to give you an idea of the scope. But there's cases like in Tacoma, for example, where we don't have a wait list because people are going to go to court. They're either going to get represented or not. And in those situations, you know, so we only take cases where our involvement is going to make a difference to the outcome of the case. So there's some folks who we do the intake and we're not going to be able to make a difference in their case, no matter what we do. Where, you know, we think everybody should have an attorney to help guide them and advise them, but we're not going to take on a case where we're just not going to be able to make a change. There's some cases actually that are, you know, more straightforward and maybe less complex, and where a lot of those cases we're actually able to place with pro bono attorneys, which volunteer attorneys, so that's a great resource. And then there's the big pool of cases that are more complicated, more difficult, and we prioritize a lot of people who've had endured particular trauma and are going to have a particularly hard time. I mean, everybody's going to have a hard time doing their case on their own, so we start with that. But there's some folks who, for example, situations where somebody's experienced, you know, sexual assault, asylum claims based on gender identity or sexual orientation, which in our experience, people have a particular difficulty that making that claim on your own is going to be particularly difficult. You need somebody, especially when you go in there before a judge, you know, asking you questions, like without being able to do that. So we look at those factors and we try to, you know, take as many as we can, but it is a terrible triage that we hate to have to do.
Hi. So you just brought up a thought, and that is there's a lot of law schools, and it would be cool if there was some kind of program for students, you know, working in groups that take on some of these cases. Is there anything that's ever been produced from that?
There's exactly that program. So the Immigrant Family Advocacy Project with the University of Washington Law School. There's also the University of Washington Immigration Clinic, both of which are work with us. The Seattle EU has also had a program. The Immigration Clinic is a little bit on hold right now. But yeah, the law schools are tremendous. Currently, the UW Immigration Law School has cases out of the detention center. You know, and the IFAT program, you know, has placed a lot of cases with domestic violence, places dozens of cases each year. I think that the difficulty is with a lot of these things is that, you know, you gotta have good supervision, and so there's a limit to what you can do, but there's actually tremendous and great partnerships in that area. So those are definitely being put to good use, and it's making a big dent in the need. It's just the need is so big.
Yeah. Okay. My second question is, and I know this may sound naive, but given that we have President Trump, and the outlook isn't good for, if he makes it 4 years, are we doing anything? I know that Mexico doesn't have a great record in helping, especially these people coming through their country from Honduras or something like that. But are we doing any more outreach with those countries to help? Maybe they could take some of the load, whether it was, you know, donations or whatever, to get some more care so these people don't have to come into this country knowing that they're probably not going to make it. Yeah. I mean, the prospect isn't good if you're coming in here right now, illegally. Are there ways to work with the government of Mexico or some? I know Honduras is a mess, but I don't know. I mean, just thinking of ways to help spearhead it somehow, so you can get them before they have to come here and kick out.
Well, I will say, I mean, I'll just say that I would be the first one to say that I think the issue of immigration needs to be resolved ultimately in the long run by helping the situation in countries. I mean, I think I share Dr. McNeil's assessment that like 90 or more percent of my clients did not want to leave their own countries. I think we have this image, and you know, for a lot of people it's true that, you know, a lot of people want to come here for economic reasons, but you know, I point to the example of Nicaragua and Central America, right? Nicaragua has actually higher poverty rates than some of the other countries in the region, but you don't see that many Nicaraguan people coming to the border. Why not? Because it's a much more stable country. There, you don't have the levels of violence that you see in places like Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador. And so I think the point is that we do need to do a lot of work in that area. Now, fortunately, I would say that the problem is that the administration, and even the Obama administration, that what they were doing, well, I'll say two things. Some of what they did with Mexico was actually to just try to stop the flow at the southern border, and so be harsh like there and stop people and sending them back. There were some very limited efforts, and I'm afraid that some of these efforts are not going to be funded going forward. There were some efforts to fund some work in places like El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras to try to develop, and I think actually Sonia Ansario wrote an article about it, and Julie, feel free to jump in if you know more, but that were showing some signs of progress in reducing violence in some of the areas, and I think if we did more to do that, I think we'd be doing great. Unfortunately, under President Trump, I think our foreign assistance is not likely to grow. So I definitely agree that there needs to be much more work done in that area.
Right.
Absolutely.
I think I heard a story, it was on either NPR or something else about Nicaragua. There was a lot of funding and money funneling to help these like orphans. They had orphanages, they had school for them, and a lot of that was curtailed, people trying to leave. It was kind of an amazing story.
We have a question back there, and I'll come back here.
Well, it was more like a comment. So I'm from Honduras, and I don't even know where to begin. You know, like the people that are running the country steal money, and everybody's filling their pockets. So I think it's a bigger issue than what we see. And with my ignorance in politics, I will bring it back to the times of the CIA using Central America for drugs and all that. So it's just so big that, and you guys may hear that it's getting better, but I have friends and it's like, oh, this person was shot, oh, this person was shot. So like, you know, like you said, you know, my mom came in that train, so it takes a lot of guts for someone to just put their kid and not know what's going to happen. So it's much bigger than what we know.
Thank you for sharing.
This is a question for Dr. McNeil. You spoke about education at clinics. I'm wondering, have any of the education efforts involved specific cultural competency around the various populations that you serve?
Yeah, I think that's something where, even though we talk about, kind of these immigrants coming from Central America and Mexico, they're still different countries, right? And there's still different needs that come from these different countries. And so some of the efforts at the University of Washington, we have what they call ethnomed. And it's a great way, it's a great resource for providers to be able to get a better understanding of
kind of where these patients come from, what is the kind of the demographics of the country, what are the political climates of the country. The other thing, you know, at Harborview, we have patients from all over the world. One of the reasons why I love working in the Seattle area is you don't have to go to a different country to practice global health, right? Seattle is like truly a global community. And with that comes a lot of need to be competent in the needs. And so I'm grateful to be at a place like the University of Washington where that's integrated into the treatment. We get emails, you know, as far as, hey, Ramadan's about to come up. We have a lot of patients who will be fasting, and especially during this time of year, kind of understanding what are the needs for medication management and things like that. You know, we have other things that we use to try and help. I mean, certainly there's still times today it's like, what is that language? I never heard that before. And so trying to be cognizant of that and recognize that where they're coming from is so unique to the experiences that I've had, and trying to keep that in mind. But luckily, at least at the University of Washington, we do have several resources to help us out with that.
One more.
Do you know if or how the mental health consequences of this are being addressed locally?
So at least in our clinic, we have a caseworker who's in the clinic that has a background in mental health and behavioral health, that we are able to pull no matter when, you know, his job is that to get there immediately for whenever we have a need. So he has no appointment scheduled whatsoever. His job is that for us to say, hey, I've got a patient that I need you to see right now, right? This is going on, and to get them plugged in to the services that they need. And then it talks a little bit about Yakima and Toppenish, and so they have similar things where they have behavioral health consultants integrated into their clinics to create more of an interdisciplinary and more immediate warm handoff is what we call in medicine, where you're talking face to face with the patient right there to make sure that ball gets rolling. I think it's not necessarily an issue of the services being there, it's the volume of patients that we're now seeing. I think that, and again, going back to what I saw in Yakima and Toppenish, is that they feel quite overburdened with the amount of patients that are coming in with anxiety, depression, PTSD, and needing these services, and just not having the time and enough bodies to really take advantage of it. I think there's some great people who are doing some great things in that area. I think we just need more people interested in helping out.
Yeah, so this is the official part of the program that's over, and as I mentioned in my opening comments, if you want to stay afterwards and talk with Jorge or Mike, you're very welcome to do so. I know that there's a board meeting that's going to be happening right now, so Northwest Children's Fund board members will be exiting. But let's give an incredible...
Yes, of course. Please
Thank you.
ask questions. Don't worry. Those who didn't get to ask.
A quick home, just kind of a housekeeping. If there are people who aren't familiar with Northwest Children's Fund, please sign in, and we'll be getting information to you. Thank you.
Are you going to go do some work while you got her?